Hello and welcome back to the Talking with Apes podcast. Today we are here with episode 16, and we have been absent for a while, but this was not without reason. We were in Glasgow participating in the COP26 event, that is the Conference of Policymakers. And it is, as you probably know if you listen to this podcast, a huge event focused on how we can combat climate change as fast as possible. It's where all the big decisions are made on what countries commit to and what they decide to ignore. So today we will discuss the things that were talked about at this conference and whether we think it was a success or a failure or something in between. So we will try to be nuanced, of course, but also remember we are here speaking as activists, as young people that still have some time to live on this planet, hopefully. So why don't I hand the mic over to Tom, who was with me at the conference, to give a first impression.
A first impression of the COP.
Talk us through first day, Tom.
Maybe we should also mention Kenan was not at COP because
it's really hard to get a visa to Scotland since I'm not a Belgian national, and just didn't really feel like a project that I could take on at the time. But since I haven't been there, maybe are we asking for a first impression on first day or last day?
It depends because Morgan was there the first day inside.
Okay.
I went the second week, so...
Okay, if we want to start with a first impression of the very first day. So I arrived there what was it? It was Sunday, yes.
Yes, Sunday.
Sunday, the 31st of October at the time. I went into this big building. I went through all the security measures, which took me 45 minutes to obtain my badge, a badge which read Observer on it, which we will probably come back to.
Had a beautiful picture on it as well.
It had an amazing picture on it. I looked like a psychopath because they tried to use an app, which don't let politicians design an app. But so I got in and I went around the big venue. I discovered where to charge my laptop, where to get food which was incredibly expensive. I noticed that most people were very busy, very much concerned with one task. So people usually don't come to COP unless they have something to do there. As we also were there to represent an organization, and we had a certain number of goals. But most of the people there are there for political, professional reasons, which creates a certain, not really office atmosphere, but definitely a sort of competitive corporate structure atmosphere. Also because the badges you get, as I said, mine read with Observer, the badges determine what you are allowed into and what your privileges are within the COP venue. So it determines where you can go, what you can eat, who you can meet with, all these kinds of things are to some extent determined by your badge. So Observer is the lowest in that rank. I was not allowed in a lot of things, especially in the beginning, because there was the World Leader Summit. So you've probably seen that on the news. President Biden was there. 130 world leaders were there giving big speeches, promising a lot of things before decisions were actually starting to be made, because that part only happens in the second week. So it was a bit of a weird atmosphere. It was a very hyperactive atmosphere. Everyone was making promises, but nobody really knew what was going to happen in that second, much more structurally important week. Also, things were still being built. There were floods in Glasgow a week before, so I think that's what made some of the building process slow. So the pavilions weren't accessible yet. And for me, in the first day, there was very little to do other than network, which is what I did. I met some Brazilian activists. I met the Belgian UN youth delegates that was there to represent, the youth council in the Belgian delegation.
Woohoo, Rena.
Yeah, and she
Good job.
Yeah, so she obviously also had a different badge than mine. She had a party overflow badge, which basically means that you're allowed into all things, but you're also the first one to be kicked out if anyone else wants to enter, and it's full. So it was just kind of an orienting yourself, getting to know where you can be and where security will tell you to fuck off. And yeah, so that was my first day. And honestly, I thought that once the World Leader Summit would be over, I would be entering into all of these meetings and really following the discussion, because, at that point, observers would also be allowed in there to some extent.
Not so much.
Yes, that was disappointing. It wasn't really at all possible even then, but even when it was possible, because I know someone who did enter some of the talks, of course, without saying anything, or like you're not allowed to do anything there.
You are very clearly an observer.
Yes,
and observers
but
are
that's
supposed
fine,
to
but
sit, watch.
But I just
silence.
noticed that you can follow these debates on YouTube, on their streaming platform. Like, there's many ways to follow these debates, to rewatch them, and for me, as someone who's not allowed to say anything there anyways, and as someone who's not allowed into any negotiations, it felt like the outside of the negotiations was much more valuable for me, because that's where the people were that I could network with, and I could only network with these people within that week. I could not rewatch that on YouTube. I could not redo it. And that was also the time when the pavilions were open, and where I could kind of look at what all the countries were presenting. A lot of greenwashing there, some interesting ideas, some good talks, some weird corporate talks. But, it was just... It was an exciting week, and so much happened, and I feel like I'm kind of all over the place right now. But yeah, so
that was the first week.
That was the first week.
I kind of share the impression for the most part. I would say to anyone that did not have the, privilege or curse to experience the COP from the inside.
Let's call it a privilege.
It's a privilege, but I will say... The reason I use the second word as well is I think it occurs a bit on civil society in general, and on all the people that actually are engaged with the climate crisis, because that place is not a decision-making process to which you are invited in any way. Let's be very clear about that, and that because that is the message it sends to everyone there, I believe. It is not for you to give any input whatsoever. It is for you to observe, to discover some things which are very carefully picked and presented. It has nothing to do necessarily with you being involved in any way. Like you said, the best thing you can do there, I believe, is network. And boy, you can network there. Let me be frank about that. It's amazing. There's so many people from all across the world there. But the entire COP itself is an extremum of our society. It is loud. It is way too fast to be able to follow anything. It is busy. It is not inclusive with the majority of people. It presents, for some countries, it presents the idea of a bit of democracy, but it doesn't actually... There's no system of democracy there.
So let me ask you this. So what was really the difference between you guys who had the observer badge and someone who was just there without the badge? Because
somebody without a badge
because you
couldn't
said,
get into the
like with the badge. Still, you weren't welcome inside the discussion room.
No, but like, so there's several levels within this huge building.
Yes.
Okay.
So there was a thing called the plenary, or there were actually 3 plenaries, I think.
Yes.
Yeah.
But so there were in the plenaries that was where the politicians would speak, where they would present
the
things.
inner
Exactly, and with a observer badge, you could enter in the back rows, and you could sit there and watch if you wanted to. So that was like what you could do in the plenary. Then there's all the meeting rooms that are private. Every delegation has one meeting room. I think there were like 270 meeting or
Yeah,
30.
there's a bunch of
Yeah,
not so clearly distinguishable white boxes.
exactly. And so, for example, the Belgian delegation, everyone with a party badge from Belgium would be allowed in there, and they would discuss the point of view of Belgium. So what do we as a country want to commit to? Who do we want to work with? What possibilities do we see at this COP? And we were not allowed in there because we didn't have party badges. We did not belong to a party. The observer badge basically means that you are part of civil society and you are there to, just be there and
Follow the negotiations, see what is being said, report back,
Yeah.
maybe check with your whatever organization you are with.
you're basically there to report back to the outside
Yes.
of your organization.
You know how during a wedding contract there are like witnesses that sign the document? That's basically
Yeah.
the observers at the COP. They are the witnesses that the process has taken place and that the decision is made, and they basically.
But you are allowed into
legitimize
the
it.
pavilion area where you
Yes.
can witness some talks, where there's a lot of networking going on.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's an event of 10,000 people.
Yes.
Yes.
So
But like,
and
for instance,
that's the blue zone. You also have to clarify a bit. You also have a green zone, which is accessible to people without a badge, where some companies and some organizations or some art installations are present that talk about climate change and how to deal with the crisis. And those two combined form the entire conference event.
That's really cool to hear. So that was your first week. You gave us your first impression. So the second week, where was like the actual negotiations happening? Was that happening in a publicly accessed place or?
no, like everything happened in the blue zone.
Huh.
Everything happens behind closed doors or a fence,
But I
more
mean,
specifically.
technically, it's publicly accessible because it's on YouTube. It's on the streaming platforms.
Yes.
Like the big negotiations are like not really the negotiations, more the presentation of what has been negotiated.
Yes, exactly.
Okay. Well, that's really. So that was your first week. What about like the second week, where we can talk about actually what's happened? I mean, if we're like fast forwarding to the end, it's the headlines that we get a lot from reading about the COP: keeping 1.5 alive, phasing out / phasing down.
Down. Officially, the last statement says phasing down. Cool.
Phasing
as
down
by
call.
gift of India, specifically at
I
that.
mean,
COP.
India backed by other countries, but
Yes. Also.
I mean, yeah, these kind of details.
Let's
Tell
also-
us about these. Like, what was the reaction inside the COP between the people you talked to? When was these things announced? Actually, were they the last day announced or?
That the Indian thing really came
Was
as a bit as a
announced after everyone
surprise. Yeah, that was in the plenary at the very end where India was like, we would like to water down this piece of language. But I mean, in the COP itself, again, it's a massive conference. The people we were most in contact with were other youth, and especially the youth constituency group. So that's a group that the UN goes to, or that the UN has as a bit of a check-in sometimes. Like, what do they think about what is going on? And that constituency group goes around all the time trying to influence negotiations by lobbying with information, lobbying with their pretty young faces, by trying to make statements. They have the right, Jungo, as an official constituency, has the right to intervene, I believe, once every negotiation meeting and make a statement, I believe, on behalf of the youth. But yeah, basically you have a bunch of young people, including our amazing youth representative, going around trying to add pieces of text, like lobby, like national delegations and negotiators to get this piece of text into the final text, into the final draft. Running around the place. Jungo also has some badges which they could use collectively to get into meetings.
That is actually really cool. Like you could follow your country's delegation and try to lobby for.
Well, if you're part of Jungo and
yeah.
you're one of the people that Jungo decided to, like, you get elected as a youth representative.
And the Belgian youth representative is.
I mean, yeah, there is a Belgian youth representative for climate specifically, and that was Renée Suissens. Now she will retire, and a new one
else
shall rise from her ashes.
No, but also Jungo also is pretty inclusive actually, because it does have some passes which any member of Jungo can use at some occasion, because they're trying to squeeze whatever they get for as much potential as is possible. So sometimes they say like, yeah, we have these 2 badges here, they're at our office space, and anyone who is a member of Jungo can come and get them. Just make sure you return them so that, you know, the next hour somebody else can make use of them immediately. And you basically have a bunch of youth running around the place trying to influence negotiations as much as possible. But
it's yeah, like if you can't lobby with money or power, you have to lobby with just being
your
there.
voice. Yes.
Yeah.
And even being seen, like even as an observer, like imagine a room full of old white men. But like now imagine that room, but there's also like 50 people watching from the global south. Like it's gonna influence how they talk about
and that's
things.
actually what I wanted to ask. Like, do you think your presence there and the presence of the civil society there, the protests outside the COP, has that influenced the decision making within the meeting rooms, or was it not influential enough?
I would say
think
absolutely, yeah.
Yes on both.
I think absolutely. Has it influenced it as much as civil society would want to? That alone, I don't think so. But if they would not be present, I mean, just you only have to look at the free trade agreements we have seen in the past of like CETA, for example. Those things are negotiated behind closed doors. There's no one present on those, and that has definitely an even worse character. I say even worse, but I very much like to push on the
Transparency.
Yeah, and to push that this text can be way more ambitious, or that way more can be done. But like, yeah, look at a free trade agreement, and you can see what happens if no one is.
I mean, yeah, if no one is there to observe, it's literally just conspiracy within like closed doors. It's just
it's politics. It's normal politics. Like,
yes, it's normal, but like when people think of like the lizard people behind closed doors,
no,
you know, like,
even then you just have geopolitics that dominate and big companies that dominate. But it's how to say this. It all has a very logical way, causality,
it has its own internal logic.
Yeah, it has its internal logic and the logic on which the world currently operates.
Definitely.
Like, it makes sense that big companies have a lot of influence, considering they have so much money.
Okay. So back to like the results of the COP. Like we know, Paris Agreement 2015. It came out with quote unquote results. There was a lot of promises, lots of pledges, lots of countries. Almost all countries in the world signed the Paris Agreement. what is the result of COP26? What did we get out with, really, concretely?
Well, a lot of promises.
Yes, lots of promises.
Actually, before you answer, like, was there any discussion in the COP26 about like the implementation of Paris Agreement and how we couldn't raise enough money for development countries? We couldn't.
Oh yeah, I mean, like that's like it was a review of what has.
It was a review of the Paris Agreement, and like
Yes.
what was the world leaders or like the people's their what was their defense, if you will?
I would argue watch the YouTube live streams for that one. It's not that they said it to us.
Yeah, and the thing is, they all, of course, have like you ask, what was the world leaders' defense? If it's one unity standing up,
not.
it's not like every country has its own narrative, its own ideas, its own pledges, its own defense.
Yes.
And I think, you know, some more plausible than others, but I don't want to speak
Clump them
about
together.
world leaders
Fair
as
enough.
one.
But you followed the
it's really-
Belgian.
But I mean, if you're asking about like what was the how did the gears click on what was actually decided upon? Well, it was a bunch of countries, of MAPA countries, most affected peoples and areas, and the states that overlap with those regions, saying like we have no funding for loss and damages, which was a big topic, saying we do not get enough money for sustainable development, for like skipping or leaving our coal and gas and oil in the ground. If that is what you guys, you being like the developed countries that already used all of the used a bunch of fossil fuels, if that is what you guys want, then you have to pay us to help us make that jump.
Yes, that kind
did
of
not
money
happen.
wasn't raised.
No, it was not. There's not a.
But if you're talking about the 100 billion pledge, is that what you mean right now? Or?
Yeah, the one that happened in Paris.
Because the thing with the 100 billion pledge is it does not specify how much of that goes to loss and damages, or if
Also-
anything goes to loss and
Yes, those are two separate things.
I'm not really talking about loss and damages here. I'm talking about like take Syria for example, a country ravaged by civil war for 10 years. It's right now starting to rebuild its infrastructure, and a lot of like young activists and young climate activists in Syria even they see this as an opportunity to start right, because you are rebuilding
Yes.
the infrastructure. And like from what I've could found online, like even though Syria did sign the Paris Agreement, there has been no financial support for this kind of sustainable models helping us build sustainable energy resources, or even like sending qualities and engineers.
Exactly.
Nothing of that happened.
So the problem with the 100 billion, when we're talking about it, is first of all, it takes a while to put up the report for knowing whether that year you succeeded in raising those 100 billion. So we're always behind 2 years. So for this year, for example, we can't really tell. For last year, we can't really tell either. But yes, we're not there yet. We're around 800 billion was what 2019 brought forth.
A million, you mean? 800 million?
No. Oh no, like 80
80 billion.
80 billion,
Okay.
yes. Right under, I think it was right under 80 billion. Sorry for my misspeak. And 100 billion is what we need. So we're about at 80%. And they expect that 2020 was a bit higher than that. But they think that it will still not have reached the 100 billion that we would need.
Unfortunate.
And
And-
a lot of MAPA countries say they actually need 300 billion.
Sorry, what is MAPA countries?
Most affected peoples and areas. So countries that roughly it's a weird word. It's a word acronym to use in synthesis. Sometimes,
Forget the
but
acronym. It's just like it's talking about something you hear on the news a lot. The global south.
Let's say Syria belongs to that because, for example,
Yes.
it is very sensitive to more droughts.
Yeah, it's people that are facing the consequences of climate change right now.
I would
already.
from what I've like seen on the news, like they use the term the global south a lot, and I do think that's kind of like if you're talking very roughly, it's the
but again,
South America, Africa.
Well, mapa is the term that those countries themselves use to describe their
Yeah, I
situation.
know. I'm just like
And
trying
does
to explain to
Bolsonaro
anybody who's
count
listening,
as-
like which countries are we talking about?
like some parts of Brazil count, but then there's, it's other parts are very heavily developed.
Yeah, that's like
so-
it is important to make a distinction between people within an area. Like you can't just
Of
say
course.
the whole area because, for example, people living in the Amazonian region are going to be way more affected than people living in
But
Rio.
eventually, like when you get these funds, you will give them to the Brazilian government.
Yeah, that's another issue that a lot of other activists talked with us about. Mainly the fact that a lot of funding goes to governments and then disappears
corruptly somehow.
within those governments, and so it is another struggle to get that funding to frontline communities themselves, who also, by the way, have the experience. They live in the environment that is damaged. They often know how to repair that environment
Yeah,
in
that's
the most
definitely
efficient
something,
way.
Yes, and within that also, let's say you just give it to those communities. It doesn't always work like that. Of
course, also.
Like, I mean, you're from Syria. Like, you can't just give money to.
I mean, you can't just give money to a bunch of
groups, you know.
farmers and expect them to come up with sustainable energy solutions.
Exactly.
You can't. And,
That's not
and,
what everybody is looking
and it
for.
also it can further destabilize a country if you would do that.
Yes.
Because you're kind of patronizing the local government and you're going behind their back, which
Yes.
can limit any further collaboration, development, and which can put people at risk that you don't want to be.
Again, I would say, I mean, I don't know, maybe I'm seeing everything from the lenses of Syria because that's where I come from. But like, I know, for example, our government, if it were to take $100 in help, it would be spending 60% on that, on its own corruption, and maybe 30% will go to actual farmers and to like actually do quality work. Like, here's the thing, like these countries will eventually, like even these corrupt governments, they, even with how stupid and brutal they are, they know that eventually they have to fix this problem. So there does go a lot of work in the quality of research, in the quality of like in projects that actually help communities. But
Of
yeah,
course, but if you give that money to those farmers directly, won't the government
no,
just
but like
take it away?
there are NGOs, there are non-governmental bodies within Syria, for example, or within Brazil, I imagine,
Yes.
that you can cooperate with without antagonizing the government.
Yeah, and that's what. For example, we had a meeting with our Belgian minister for development cooperation. That is also what she said. Like especially when a stable government is missing, as is the case in a lot of places. You know, and a very small amount of states is very stable in the world. Then they look for NGOs that can supply those things. But of course, you know, the entire thing, I think the point is the entire thing is mingled up with politics and international politics, because that is what reality is like. And if you antagonize a national government, you, of course, can also expect the military of said national government to, for example, coerce local communities out of that money again. So you're always walking a very fine line and
Of
trying to
course.
balance yourself on that line. Which is not to say that the United Nations is currently always doing a perfect job at that. Far from it. But so it is
They're
it's
doing
a
their
complex
best.
mess.
It's a very like when it comes to
I also don't want to compliment them in that way.
yeah, but like I will say like probably the most complicated part of this, like when you get down to it about redistributing funds, the geopolitics of it, that is like country specific. You can't have all poor countries will have the same policy. Like you will have to, for every delegation and for every country, you will have to have a different situation and to cooperate with different people.
Yeah, and maybe don't call them poor countries.
I mean, I don't, like that's honestly that's the way I think of it. But yeah, it doesn't come down to money in the end.
If it's about the development and the loss and damages. Yes, the loss and damages is also about other stuff.
Yes.
Loss and damages also includes loss
Human
of
life.
physical land, loss of cultures, loss of life, indeed loss of many things.
The most affected countries. I'm sorry. You talked about the effect that civil society had, like in their presence there, but at the same time, this COP specifically has been called like the whitest COP ever, and there was a lot of complaint. Like we talked about this in another episode of the podcast about the fears of lack of diversity within the COP26. Talk to me about that. Like, what did you think from you being on the ground?
Yeah, well, I think coming from a European country and this being my very first COP, and I am white myself for people listening.
He's white as fuck.
you probably know, even though you don't see me.
We have pictures on the website, Morgan.
No, but I mean, yeah, you can tell that I'm white probably from what I say. Yeah, so like I have my own biases, blah blah blah. You know,
Of course.
Disclaimer.
That disclaimer out of the way. I am privileged, and I talking from a privileged point of view. Even me, a Syrian living in Belgium, like I am also in that position where I'm not affected. And
so like in any way, so like I think that yes, it's very white, especially once you go into any, like if when you start taking away people with observer badges, it becomes extremely white. And even like, for example, I followed a group.
just so we're clear, when we say white, we mean like Westerners, Western countries.
I mean, I'm talking skin colors right now.
Huh.
I'm talking, yeah, like because
No, because like what I was referring to is like the lack of representation of like most affected countries, maybe, or like indigenous cultures.
yes, but like I was gonna get into
Go
the
ahead.
details of it because, for example, even people from most affected people in areas, I talked to a group of Brazilian youth, and even within their group, there was only one person with indigenous background. If I like that, I talked to personally. Of course, there were more in the whole Brazilian delegation, but that's the people that I talked to.
The group of people you talk to.
Yes, exactly. And there were several white people, like they were very white passing. They could have passed easily as, you know, Spanish people or whatever. And then there was like two people who were not really white, like who were not super white, and one girl that was like considered black. And so like just looking at that, like most of the people from the young Brazilians could still pass as European white people.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's even within the discrimination, you notice that the most privileged people within their country that are able to attend COP are also more white people.
Of course.
So like, you know,
I mean,
it's
in the end, it's really like, I don't like, maybe you don't agree, like, you know, my opinion about like the thing in the end, like with not to its root, racism obviously exists also on just a racial bias, but I do think in a lot of levels it comes down to classism. And would you say like the people who had the privilege to even come to COP, like
are from a higher class.
I
yeah.
from a higher
Yes.
class.
I don't
Yes.
think I've seen anyone who's not like middle class.
But you also talked to me about someone who basically spent his whole life savings to.
not,
Yeah, so
yeah, but
that is
he's a lawyer.
yeah. So
Yeah, but like I do think it's like that person, like in the global economy, on the global scale, isn't like it's not about he's not a rich person who is very privileged.
no, because I mean that's it's because of some of the reasons why the COP became so exclusionary. Like prices were through the roof for everything.
Yes.
It was expensive within the COP itself. Stuff is expensive. And yes, countries like Brazil have NGOs, but they have way less NGOs, way less big NGOs, as those, for example, in the European Union, who have grown big and strong on the fact that they exist within welfare states. You know, states that actively want a civil society to function. Like the Belgian state, for example, actively works on the concept of having a civil society that is a bridge between parliamentary politics and the people. And thus, Belgium, you see that as well in the delegation, includes those people in its delegation. Reine, as a youth representative, got included, but also one representative from the unions, representatives from Climate Coalition, this coalition of civil society, were included. Somebody from Oxfam, somebody from other things.
As in contrast to maybe...
As in contrast with the majority of countries that don't do that.
Like all the Brazilian people I talked to came to COP with badges from English organizations or organizations from other European countries.
And the Brazilian delegation itself had...
the Brazilian delegation was huge. They had like 130 people.
I mean, it's a huge country.
But they basically gave badges to personnel. Like, for example, like people serving popcorn in the Brazilian Pavilion had a fancy party badge, even though they were just there. Like, they weren't part of any negotiations, but they had the fancy badge, especially if they were younger, because that way Brazil could be like, hey, look at all these young people we brought.
So you think that part of it was a PR...
Oh, definitely.
Yes, yes, and that is for all youth present. That I think we can. I think it was one of the statements made by the youth constituencies. Yeah, call it youth washing, call it whatever you want. Window dressing. We were definitely decoration for a lot of people, and not just the youth. The Indigenous Peoples constituency made that very clear as well. Justin Trudeau, for example, was there taking pictures with Indigenous people from Canada, and at home, those people end up in prison because they defend their land from exploitation from his government. Yeah. So the entire thing goes along with
honestly, every time someone was wearing any sort of like clothing that made them, show their Indigenous heritage, immediately 50 cameras were on them. And
these people were there as a part of civil society observers. So like for example, the Justin Trudeau case, like maybe the Canadian delegation had like Indigenous people within it.
I don't know specifically about the Canadian delegation, but a lot of these people were either as part of a constituency group there and or with an NGO that they managed to get a badge from.
To make their voices heard.
As well. I also don't think Western civil society fully understood or is fully aware at home of how difficult it is for people from these regions of the globe to get to such an event.
Get here. Yeah.
And also that a lot of those people go there to also interact with them. Like the NGOs from Belgium and from Europe, for example, are there to try and influence negotiations. But a lot of people from other parts of the world are also there to connect with those Western NGOs, because those Western NGOs, again, have resources that are completely lacking in other places of the globe.
Yeah.
And they can contribute a lot. So I think it's something they should actively look further into, talk with some people about, so they can be aware of how much maybe power and contribution they can have in the world.
So we can say that this COP has been pretty exclusionary.
Yes.
Yes. There were a lot of observers there that were maybe not I think if we say, oh, the COP was super exclusionary and it was only people from Europe and America, that's not fair, because the world was there, but did they have a say? No. Did they have any other function than being window dressing and being the voice of the Indigenous people in some moments when media was there? Not really. Also, feminist organizations and stuff that were there, and a lot of talk about gender equality. There was a whole day around gender, but there was
our pre-COP podcast. We talk about a lot of delegations who couldn't actually make it because of COVID when it comes to Indigenous delegates or
was the case with some of the other youth activists we met up with. I believe it was the Colombians. They did not have their second vaccination shot yet. Meanwhile, Belgium is talking about a third shot.
A third, fourth.
It is, and it is a very stark contrast with especially how UK has been talking about it and what it was in reality.
What are you referring to?
Well, the UK, of course, is been promoting the shit out of this. So saying, look how good we do, look how well we're doing.
Yeah.
We're doing everything we can to get these people involved, etc. Meanwhile,
the only person from Afghanistan that was eligible for a badge did not get his visa approved.
Yeah, the local youth activists of Fridays for Future, I believe it was, in Glasgow, in Scotland, have been fighting the Home Office of the UK over visas for people that wanted to come to Scotland the entire time. Like, they have had a very exhausting battle with them. So no, the UK has not done not a good job, not even a decent job.
So,
the UK has been an asshole host.
Talking about our host, so it was a shit show when it came to visas. It was a shit show when it came to, I will say like obviously you were there, you had to like rent a place to stay there, you had to eat, you had to drink, and prices were through the roof.
I mean,
And
also the
don't you
pound being extremely
Yeah,
high.
but like, don't you think like is it like crazy to maybe expect a cop to like provide for the people with like badges maybe, or like maybe you get like lodgings?
Well, they do
food?
if you're very important.
Yeah,
Like, maybe they should include, like,
country delegation, but then you're stuck with the fact that a country like Brazil invites all its waiters as a party delegation and not its actual not anything civil society wise. But I don't think the idea is that weird. Though again, some countries probably don't want their communities to get too much of a correct report back from what is happening there. Again, I mean, the example is clear. The bigger the polluter, the bigger the pavilion was. And the less people were tended to be in it as well. Often.
I mean,
Qatar,
also,
Saudi Arabia.
I just feel like it's also a problem that this event happens. Like the event being in Britain or like the UK. Not Britain. I don't know how that.
Great Britain is one of the two islands on which the UK is based. Yes,
that it's there. Just also creates those high prices. It also creates partially the problem. So I think maybe you should look into if the event is held in a country that is very rich, yes, then they should definitely provide for accommodation and basic. Food needs, but let's say.
I mean, honestly, I'm not even talking about providing, but like what from you guys told me about, like when you were looking for a place to sleep, there was a lot of opportunism. Prices went through the roof because they knew there was a lot of quote unquote tourists, politicians talking about something a bit like maybe a bit of control. So this thing doesn't become so exclusionary to people who can't afford it.
But it's not meant to be non-exclusionary. I mean, we're talking about what it.
I mean, it's called the Conference of
the
Policy.
Of the parties.
I thought it was the Conference of
the parties. But the parties in this case are the political representatives of the United Nations thing.
It felt like the Conference of the Policymakers.
Yeah, because that is what it is. Let's be frank. At the end, even Obama can give a beautiful speech at the COP. Right, it doesn't matter. He's not actually the president at the moment anymore. Biden is, and Biden decides that he doesn't want loss and damages to go through. The same as well for the European Union. Belgium can fuck up all it wants, which it did gloriously. But in the end, it's Frans Timmermans of the European Commission that actually talks and to which people listen.
He's a good speaker.
Yeah, based on his rhetoric skills are very good.
Talk about I'm very interested in what you said. Like the bigger the polluter, the bigger the pavilion. What is from what you've seen like something really interesting? I think we all saw the penguin one with like from last week tonight. They talked about it with the
That was a cute small
penguin
pavilion.
hanging
Yes.
themselves.
I mean, one of a number of things stuck out to me. One, as somebody from Antwerp, the factory that has been polluting Antwerp, Flanders, and probably entire Western European coast, 3M. No, 3M. This is 3M. 3M was there as a
Ineos
sponsor
has also been
Right.
for the United Nations on Climate Change Pavilion.
The
It was there.
the corporate representation there.
Yeah, there was an entire pavilion for companies of business for climate, business for climate. That one jumped out to me. The Benelux pavilion was sad.
They had beautiful.
But why does the
beautiful
They
Benelux-
had foam leather stuck to
beautiful white
plastic
walls as
and
well?
it fell off at some point, and it was very sad.
It was just an ugly office.
Yes, and the other thing that, and that's maybe a little bit of a fun one. So you had the European Union Pavilion on one hand, you had the British Pavilion on the other, and in between, Great Britain had found nothing better than to put the Commonwealth
Yes,
Pavilion
I've
to
heard.
show how many countries they
Yes,
connect
I
with.
did. I did love that.
And then in an alleyway almost behind the European Union Pavilion, you found the African Union Pavilion. So the entire setup very much felt like...
And like just so I can like
Geopolitical
be there
jokes.
and like our listeners. So like when you go to a pavilion, like do they offer you brochures? What do they like? Is there
Well,
people
you have
to
to
talk
follow
to?
the talk. And if you follow the talk, so like you sit there for like an hour and you listen to all of them like greenwashing their country and their policies, then you get a present, which can be food.
That was not what happened at the Belgian one when I was there. I did not get anything.
No, but like some countries are famous for their presents. So I think it was Tunisia. They give like really fancy presents, but they
should
don't
have known
give it
that.
to people that
So
don't
the
follow
Belgian
them.
pavilion, like since we are in Belgium and like we do discuss all
I
the Belgian
shared the
politics.
Benelux pavilion shared with the European Investment Bank, to be precise.
Yes, so it was
Huh.
three
So
countries
it's
and
the
the
Netherlands,
bank.
Yes.
the Netherlands, Luxembourg, and Belgium had one pavilion.
And the European Bank.
European Bank of Investment. What did they talk about in this pavilion? Like, also you did meet with Rea. No,
Rea?
not like
Rena, you mean?
Reina.
Reno.
Yes.
Reina.
Yes.
Also, sorry.
No, it's good.
Do talk to me about like what was your experience of her? Like,
Wait, do you? What
Well,
question do you want answered?
Well, for very shortly, so the Belgian Pavilion had a panel conversation on mobility and how it needed to how we need to switch mobility
Oh, yeah.
to a
That's
more
a big one.
sustainable system. Though it was one privatization fest. It was like yes, and then we can have companies do these things, and we can get private capital to do all these things. So it was. They didn't say anything about like
I mean,
the
I will have
social
to
rights
say, like
of
for a lot
or
of
public.
average Joes, if you will, like when they think about these things, one of the things that like talk to people the most is the mobility one. Like, are we going to be switching to electric cars? Are we not going to be able to own cars?
According
later?
to the pavilion,
there was there was this one Belgian politician who wanted to like apply even more taxes on everybody who owns a car and like not really solve the solution and it's at its truth, just make it more individual responsibility.
Yeah, that's basically what you get with most pavilions. But
I mean, yeah,
is
like talking about
interesting.
cars, at
More
least
interesting.
like because in Europe a lot of cars are produced in Germany, and I know that, for example, Mercedes now signed that by 2030 they will stop producing any cars that are not electric. So, any cars that are being designed within the next 5 to 10 years are going to be electric and electric only. So that is where we're heading.
I mean,
And
I know this is a very like it deserves its own episode, but like, do you think that moving to electric cars is like
the solution? No, obviously not.
not right? Like,
No. But like
manufacturing-
you asked like what
Yeah.
is transportation? Like transportation is a big thing, and yes, but like personally, I think we shouldn't move to private electric cars. We should move to public transport that
I agree.
is electric.
Is anybody talking about that?
But
Like, it feels like nobody agrees with that.
Yeah,
Everybody
they were
wants-
talking about it a little bit, but that makes me think of the German pavilion. Which
Oh, the German pavilion was hilarious. They made it have like fun colors. And then they had this glass because they wanted to be extra COVID proof. Like no other pavilion had this. But they had this little room in which like the people giving the talk would sit in on a row. And then there was glass in between it, and the glass was like surrounded by wood. Like it was exactly how you would see it in a zoo.
I'm honestly gonna look up pictures because I can't imagine like what you're describing.
Yeah, it's
and I
just
would encourage
imagine
everybody
like
to
zoo.
Yeah.
Imagine a zoo.
Imagine a zoo.
But like
Jesus.
a zoo, which is completely like the inside of the part where the animals are is
Okay.
completely white. It has 4 office chairs, and it has 4 politicians in it. It's a perfect description of what,
A work of art.
you know.
Yes.
Yeah, honestly, like if this would have been like a meta piece of art, I would have loved it.
I mean, isn't it?
maybe I
I'm
don't-
not sure.
Oh, the Japanese, no, it was South Korea, I believe, was advocating for hydrogen, on which we already did an episode, with K-pop. So they were really pulling out
course.
all the.
I also heard about the United Arab Emirates had a very big pavilion.
Yes.
And,
Oh yes,
Qatar as well.
Qatar. Yes.
Saudi Arabia also had a fancy one. The only other big pavilions were, of course, the United States, which was
The
somewhere tucked
Brazilian
in the back.
governmental
The Brazilians had 2, no?
yeah, the Brazilians
Yeah.
had 2, but one was civil society, which was very like cozy with like all these pictures taken
Grassroots.
by, yeah, like it was that. But then there was the governmental one, which had like these big LED
Screens
that were like they were like bent in like
It was
half sphere, and there was like all this food and presents, and there were like
just like from my perception, it's like from what I've heard from the Qatar, from the United Arab Emirates, from the Saudi, like these countries are big polluters, and their economy
Yes.
is basically oil based.
The USA also had a very big pavilion, though that was chucked in the back, I think, because nobody wanted to deal with the Americans. I don't know, it was a bit hidden.
Like what was, I don't know if you stopped there, but like I should have also looked this up before the podcast. But I'm just like very interested in like a country like you said, the Brazilian government or Qatar or United Arab Emirates. Like what are they actually doing in their pavilion? Like are they talking about
well,
movement from oil-based economy to a sustainable
I'm
economy?
talking about natural gas, hydrogen, unspecified which type. They're talking about.
no, I mean
reabsorbment of CO2.
I mean, they also like they do talk about ambitious goals. Like, for example, Brazil was like, "We will end illegal deforestation."
I mean, yeah, that's a goal actually at the end of the COP. Like there is end deforestation by 2030.
Yeah, Brazil signed that, and but like the thing is, those are all voluntary things. And in 2014, there was a similar goal to end deforestation. Also, nothing happened with that. So we can't really be sure what they mean, what they don't mean. All the things they say in the pavilion are also just promises. Nobody's going to hold them accountable to it, except for civil society. That's why they are there as observers, to hold people accountable to the shit they say at COP. But what Brazil, for example, presented mainly from my point of view, like was the things they have. Like they were talking about all the amazing biodiversity and how amazing the rainforest is, how fertile all the grounds there are, and how much potential there is.
And then it's like, you're going to preserve that potential, right?
And they're like,
Right?
well, we will definitely
How much are you paying?
do the same thing we've been doing.
It was and I mean the Colombian one as well. It was a Colombian one, right? Or the Brazilian as well. I don't know. At one point when they were giving a talk, these 2 men, very shady looking, like they were mafioso sitting
That
in
was
a chair.
Brazil. That was the video
Brazil.
that I did at the Brazilian.
Yeah.
Hub.
They give up a weird vibe. Also
They do.
Colombia, the Colombian youth activists that we met confronted their government or somebody from the government at the pavilion were completely ignored.
So I think that's one more thing that civil society can do at COP. Confront your leaders. Like, you are in a small space with them. You can talk to them. You can ask questions. And
Yes.
media is there. Like, maybe they won't answer, but media will have recorded that they refuse to answer questions. And that is, I think, maybe one of the most important things to do if you're inside. For example, the Brazilian youth I followed, they tried to ask questions. Their leaders
Yeah, they also
ignored.
did
They
it.
said no questions. But after that, they got to speak to several opposition leaders. Like Bolsonaro wasn't there, but a lot of the people running in the election next year against him were there. And of course, those were happy to get young voters and to be
have
on
again the
pictures and-
pictures.
yeah, so like you can use youth washing in your favor. You can use
obviously,
the
everything about
diversity card in your favor.
And the Colombians did the same thing. Had success in almost like having their politicians leave with their heads down, a bit like, oh fuck, this is becoming bad publicity, and then have spread that recording and are still trying to spread that recording as widely as possible, because their president gets received at such events by Western leaders as the example of South America, while at home he's letting his police forces like shoot at protests, etc., doing jack shit for the climate.
Yeah.
So again, it's that exposure that you can get there.
In the end, it's like also, like this exposure, like also with the indigenous communities, like, yes, they are being used sometimes as window dressing and as a way to take pictures, but that doesn't mean that they aren't there for a reason. They are there to make their voices heard.
I think you just have to use the fact that everyone underestimates you there if you have an observer badge. Like, if you're not party, you're kind of overlooked, but that means that you can use your time without being watched, and you can plan things, you can try to get into the media, you can try to make things happen.
The youth there is anything but dumb.
Oh, we know.
Really, like, it cannot be stressed enough how professional Jungo is, for example, how active all of the youth activists there are. Like the Brazilians were non-stop with actions, with drawing attention. They themselves, in combination with other South American groups, they were talking with NGOs. They were again confronting their politicians. So the youth there is also acutely aware of the fact of how people are trying to use them and are trying to find ways to do stuff. So it's by no means that they were just moved around or something, or you completely used without any further thought. They themselves have I mean, it was in that sense very beautiful, I think, and very activating
that
to
is
see them
amazing.
so engaged.
So is there like what I wanted to ask, like from what you've told me before the podcast and during the podcast, like the Brazilian youth, the Colombian youth, what about I wanted to talk like end the podcast on like the Belgian note, like what is being done in the Belgian delegation, what was discussed. You talked about meeting with the youth representative. Talk to me about Belgium in general when it came to COP26.
Well, I met with Rene over the course of the 2 weeks of COP. And at first she was unsure of her role there, also because Belgium did not deliver a climate agreement in time for COP. They just kind of followed the European point of view. And this created some uncertainty into what collaborations she could commit to, etc. But yeah, she is part of Jungo. She is part of that whole youth network connected to the UNFCCC, triple C. So so she did what she could, and towards the end of COP, she kind of found the hook that she wanted to work around, and that turned out to be a youth paragraph within the final agreement. So now, for the first time ever, really, except for I think in the Kyoto Protocol, which is a completely different thing that was there before the Paris Agreement. For the first time, there is a youth paragraph in there that says that. I don't have the exact text here. I don't want to misquote.
Just give us the.
Well, yeah, it's just about that they have to take youth voices more into account and see how they can make them more a part of this whole negotiation. And it's not much, but it's a start, and it's something that can be used in negotiations to have more leverage.
That is definitely something very nice to hear, especially in the shadow of the Belgian environment minister taking a vacation during.
Which one? No, that's the whole ordeal.
Tell us about that.
I don't think we have.
Yeah, we don't.
I mean,
here is the very quick rundown of it, because Belgium has a weird political structure.
Yeah.
Each part of it has to agree so that the whole thing can agree. There is no agreement. That's what it came down to. And then the politicians were basically saying like, "Oh, so we can't really do anything here," which raises the question: why did they go? If they, if Timmermans speaks for Europe and they are not going to do anything more ambitious, why do they go?
So by default, Belgium will have to follow what Europe this time.
Yeah. I mean, they have to fit into it.
In this case.
No, I mean, yes, Belgium has to fit into whatever Europe decides, but they can fill in how they fit into it.
Yes.
Do they cut down on the emissions from the Antwerp harbor, or do they cut down on the emissions of heating houses, or, they just have to meet the goals, basically.
Yeah. But yeah, at the moment it's Belgium's index on climate action also fell to a level of like India and some developing countries. So it's its own episode almost. How
maybe we should
terrible the country did. Yeah, it's a complicated little mess, but it's also luckily an irrelevant little mess for that specific moment. Moment,
the fact that Belgium did not have a concrete climate action plan does not weigh in, since Europe does have the goals in place. So Belgium will have to adapt anyways, and if they want to be slow about that, it's just going to bite themselves in the ass.
Exactly.
That was the COP 26. Some people called it the FLOP 26.
Find better names, people.
There was the crying head of the meeting, like the person who apologized for youth, saying that not enough was done. And I think a lot of activists do think that not enough was done. But the public discourse.
Let's actually put an example on that. At the end, in the second week, at the last day of COP, not the actual last day, but the last day that was planned, each constituency of the United Nations, so youth, indigenous communities, the women and gender constituency, the constituency for handicapped people, the constituency of the trade unions, they all gathered with the entire civil society in the plenary room, which is normally taken for the heads of state, and they each gave a speech about how disastrous this COP has been and how the system is not delivering on what we need. And then we all walked out together. Then
we formed a red line in front of the building together with the civil societies that had gathered for a protest outside.
It is very clear that if it's up to civil society, this process is not enough, is not the way to go, is not the way to do it. And I think that was also, but that's again worthy of its own episode, represented in the People Summit, which civil society in Glasgow organized as a accessible counter version of the COP, to which everyone was invited. And we can very legitimately say that yes, this COP has been an improvement if we watch it through the process of COP25 to COP24, it's another step in the right direction, but does it do enough to achieve 1.5 degrees? No. Will this process, at the speed at which it is going, do enough? No.
Yeah, so the question is, how do we reform this process, maybe?
Exactly.
Or have another process in place. Because the COP is like, by UN standards, it's like the highest form of...
Yeah, probably a combination of reform on the one hand, of moving the United Nations in another direction, and on the other hand, developing whatever we would want that to go towards ourselves as civil society, because at this speed, no, we're not going to get there.
And yeah, and people are already dying,
Exactly.
people are already suffering. So it's also a question of, do we want to continue at this pace, because we will keep excluding people more and more as their countries are suffering more and more, and as it becomes harder and harder for people to take out 2 weeks from saving their own home to come here and try to get a glimpse of media attention or some photos with politicians. So yeah, maybe this is the note we end this on.
Unfortunately, but at the same time.
I mean, I think it's not that bad. I think there's hope for improvement. I think this COP did something. We're less fucked than we were before, and we just need to keep the pressure up, because the pressure keeps rising. And
I do agree with that. I do think like several pressure shouldn't be like concentrated in these like every 5 years events. It should be constant about policymakers, with your elections, with your votes. Vote people who actually care about the climate. And I know, like, this is basically the most you can do, and on a structural level.
Trust us that there was a positive element to it as well with the People Summit, which we will
talk about in another episode. We should probably talk about in another episode about what was happening outside of the COP too.
Yes,
exactly.
So until next time.
Until next time, see you then. Bye.
Bye. Subscribe
and like and share and give us your feedback, because we are open